She said it loud enough that even the silverware stopped clinking against the plates. "You're a hateful man." In my own home. At the table I bought back when my son wasn't even a thought in my life. I ran a construction company for 38 years, survived recessions, audits, and partners who tried to edge me out. But in that moment, I realized the hardest pressure I'd ever felt wasn't coming from the outside. It was sitting across from me, smiling at the guests, and had been telling me for months that it was time to think about the future and transfer what I built to the next generation. My name is Arthur Vance. I am 74 years old, and I've lived in the same brick house in Fort Worth, Texas, since 1982. I built Vance Structural from a single pickup truck and a toolbox into a firm that laid the foundations for half the shopping centers in this county. I worked 6 days a week for 40 years, missing more birthdays than I care to admit, all so my son, Leo, would never have to know what it felt like to have a bank call about a late payment. Leo is 41 now. He's a good man, or at least I always believed he was. He started working for me after college, but he never had that grit, that late-night hunger to check the blueprints one last time. Then he met Elena. She came into the family 5 years ago, a high-end real estate agent with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. At first, it was subtle. Small comments at Sunday dinners about how modernizing the company would require a younger touch. Then came the talk about estate planning and how keeping the business in my name was a tax liability for Leo's future. Elena started bringing brochures for retirement communities in Florida to the house, leaving them on the kitchen island like they were just casual reading. The pressure moved from suggestions to demands over the last year. They wanted me to sign over the majority share of Vance Structural to Leo, with Elena acting as the new business development director. They framed it as a family legacy, a way to ensure the Vance name lived on while I finally took a rest. But every time I looked at the paperwork they had drawn up, I didn't see a legacy. I saw a liquidation plan. The tension had been simmering like a pot left on the stove too long, and by the time the turkey was carved this Thanksgiving, the lid finally blew off. Elena wasn't just asking anymore. She was telling the table that I was holding my son back from his own potential. When I told her the company stayed with me until I was horizontal, she didn't even flinch before calling me hateful in front of the whole family. I looked at Leo, waiting for him to tell his wife to sit down, but he just stared at his plate and adjusted his tie. Leo didn't look up. He didn't defend me, and he didn't tell his wife she had crossed a line. He just sat there, tracing the pattern on his cloth napkin with a heavy silver fork. The silence in the dining room was thick, the kind that rings in your ears long after the shouting stops. My sister Martha cleared her throat and tried to ask about the cranberry sauce, but the air was already poisoned. "Arthur, be reasonable," Elena said, her voice dropping from a shout to that dangerous, artificial calm she used when she was closing a deal. "We aren't talking about taking anything away. We're talking about protection. You're 74. If something happens to your health tomorrow, the city contracts are in limbo. The bank needs a guarantor with a longer runway." I looked at her, then at my son. "I've had a long runway for 40 years, Elena. I've never missed a payroll, even in 2008 when the rest of Fort Worth was folding up their tents." "That was a different world, Dad," Leo finally muttered, still not meeting my eyes. "The industry is digital now. The overhead is killing us because you won't authorize the new equipment leases. Mark over at the HVAC firm, you remember Mark? He transitioned his parents' place years ago. They're happy. They're traveling." I felt a cold shiver go down my spine. I remembered Mark. I also remembered hearing through the grapevine that his parents had ended up in a 2-bedroom condo after their legacy business defaulted on a massive line of credit. "Is that what this is?" I asked, leaning back. "You want me to sign the personal guarantee for a new round of debt so you can buy those fancy excavators we don't have the contracts to support yet?" Elena leaned forward, her jewelry clinking. "It's called growth, Arthur. But you're so buried in the past you can't see that you're becoming the bottleneck. You're holding the keys to a kingdom you're too tired to rule, and you're making us all suffer for your pride." I looked around my table. I had built this life brick by brick, honest and slow. I had given Leo everything: private schools, a debt-free start, a vice presidency he hadn't quite earned. And now, they were looking at me like I was a squatter in my own home. "The dinner is over," I said quietly. Elena laughed, a sharp, jagged sound. "Fine, but don't think a quiet house is going to solve this. The bank sent the revised terms Friday. They're expecting a signature by Monday morning, or the operating line gets frozen." I watched them walk out, my son following his wife like a shadow, and I realized they hadn't come for Thanksgiving at all. They had come for an execution. The front door clicked shut, leaving me in a house that suddenly felt cavernous and drafty. I didn't clear the plates. I sat there staring at the half-eaten turkey, thinking about the operating line Elena had mentioned. In 40 years of business in Fort Worth, I had never let a bank dictate my dinner conversation. I knew my numbers. Vance Structural was sitting on $3 million in equipment and a backlog of municipal contracts that should have kept us liquid for a decade. If the line was being frozen, it wasn't because of the economy. It was because someone had been overextending the company's credit without my signature. I walked into my small home office and pulled a locked ledger from the bottom drawer. I started tracing the draws on our corporate accounts from the last 6 months. There were payments to a luxury automotive group and a series of consulting fees paid to an LLC I didn't recognize, Emerald Coast Strategies. A quick search showed the LLC was registered in Elena's maiden name. My son wasn't just asking for the business. He was already bleeding it dry to fund the lifestyle Elena demanded. He was using my reputation, my 40 years of sweat, as a revolving door for debt. The next morning, Friday, I didn't go to the yard. I drove to the bank downtown. I've known the branch manager, Bill Higgins, since he was a teller. I laid the ledger on his desk and asked him point blank why my operating line was at risk. Bill looked pained. He slid a document across the desk that made the blood drain from my face. It was an application for a $500,000 expansion loan, dated 3 weeks ago. It bore my signature, a perfect, sweeping Arthur Vance that I knew I hadn't written. "Leo brought this in," Bill said quietly. "He said you were under the weather but had given him full authority to modernize the fleet. Arthur, if this isn't your signature, we have a massive problem." I looked at the ink. It was a masterpiece of betrayal. My own son had sat at my table, eaten my bread, and then walked into a bank to sign my name away. "Give me until Monday," I told Bill. My voice sounded like gravel. "Don't process anything, just give me 72 hours. I drove home and sat in my driveway, watching the neighbors' kids play touch football. I thought about the time I taught Leo to swing a hammer. I thought about the pride I felt when he graduated from Texas Christian University. Then I thought about the cold, hard no I had to say. I picked up the phone and called a lawyer I'd used for contract disputes back in the 90s, a man who didn't care about family legacies, only the law. "I need to protect my assets," I said when he picked up, "and I might need to report a fraud." The lawyer, a man named Silas Thorne, met me on Saturday morning at his office near the Tarrant County Courthouse. He didn't offer coffee or small talk. He just looked at the bank documents and the ledger I'd brought from the house. "Arthur, this isn't just a family dispute anymore," Silas said, tapping a pen against the forged loan application. "This is bank fraud. If you move forward with a formal report, your son isn't just looking at a lost job. He's looking at a felony charge." I stared out the window at the Fort Worth skyline I'd helped build. I thought about the 3 boys in the stories I'd read, David, Mark, and Andrew, who had used their father's name like it was nothing more than a line of credit. I realized then that my son had become one of them. He wasn't trying to modernize the legacy. He was trying to pawn it. "What are my options?" I asked. "You can sign the papers, let them have the business, and hope they don't bankrupt you before you die," Silas said bluntly. "Or you can lock down every account, revoke his power of attorney, and file a police report for the forgery." I drove home and found Leo's car in my driveway. He was sitting on the porch steps, looking like the boy who used to wait for me to come home from the job site. But when he stood up, his face was tight with that same defensive posture Elena had taught him. "Dad," Bill Higgins called me, Leo said, his voice shaking. "He said you were asking questions. Why would you go behind my back like that?" "Behind your back?" I asked, my voice dangerously low. "I'm the one who built this company, Leo. You're the one who signed my name to a $500,000 lie." "It was for the business," he shouted, throwing his hands up. "We needed the cash flow to cover the new leases. Elena said if we didn't show growth, the investors would walk." "There are no investors, Leo. There's just my retirement and the equity in this house," I said. "And you risked both without even looking me in the eye." He looked at me then, and for a second, I saw a flash of regret. But then his phone buzzed in his pocket, a text from Elena, no doubt, and his expression hardened again. "If you don't sign that authorization by Monday, the payroll checks for the crew are going to bounce," he said. "Is that what you want? To be the man who put 20 families out of work because of his ego?" "No," I said, walking past him to the front door. "I'm the man who's going to make sure those families get paid by someone they can actually trust." I went inside and locked the door. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark and made a list of every employee at Vance Structural. I knew their wives' names, their kids' schools, and their mortgage payments. I wasn't going to let my son drown them just so his wife could drive a car we couldn't afford. On Sunday morning, I sent a single text to Leo and Elena. "Meet me at the office at 8 tomorrow. Bring your lawyer." I knew then that the hateful man was about to become the most honest man they had ever met. Monday morning in Fort Worth was gray and heavy with the smell of rain. I arrived at the Vance Structural offices at 7:30, letting myself in with the brass key I'd carried for nearly 4 decades. I didn't turn on the overhead lights in the lobby. I just sat in my old leather chair, listening to the hum of the refrigerator in the break room, thinking about the 20 families whose livelihoods were currently tethered to a forged signature. At 8 o'clock sharp, Leo and Elena walked in. They weren't alone. They had a young man in a slim-fit suit with them, the kind of attorney who looks like he spends more time on his hair than on his briefs. Elena was wearing a coat that probably cost as much as a new set of tires for a backhoe, and she didn't even look at the photos of the crew on the wall. "Arthur, let's keep this professional," the young lawyer said, sliding a folder across my desk. "We have an agreement here. You step down as CEO, retain a silent 20% stake, and the bank fraud allegations stay internal. It's the cleanest way for everyone." I looked at the folder, then at my son. Leo was staring at a coffee stain on the carpet. "Is that what you want, Leo?" I asked. "You want to blackmail your father into retirement because you and your wife spent the company's operating capital on consulting fees and Italian marble." "It's not blackmail, Dad," Leo said, his voice cracking just a bit. "It's a transition. You're 74. You shouldn't be worrying about payroll taxes and equipment leases anymore. We're just trying to protect the assets." "Protect them for who?" I asked. "The bank? Because right now, the only thing protecting this company is my name, and you used it like a blank check." I stood up and pulled a stack of documents from my own briefcase, the ones Silas Thorne had helped me prepare. I laid them out one by one. "This is a formal revocation of Leo's power of attorney," I said, my voice steady. "This is a notice to the bank that the loan application dated 3 weeks ago is unauthorized and fraudulent. And this," I paused, looking directly at Elena, "is a demand for the immediate return of the $140,000 paid to Emerald Coast Strategies for services never rendered." Elena's face went from pale to a sharp, mottled red. "You can't do that. You'll bankrupt the company if you pull that loan now. You'll be the one putting those men out of work." "No," I said. "I've already spoken to the foreman. I'm meeting the crew at the yard at 10. I'm paying this week's payroll out of my personal savings, the money I worked 39 years to build." I looked at my son, waiting for him to step in, to apologize, to tell his wife to leave. But he just looked at Elena, waiting for her to tell him what to do. "You have until 5 o'clock to clear your desks," I said. "If you're still here when the sun goes down, I'm calling the police to report the trespass and the forgery." They left, Elena's heels clicking like gunfire on the linoleum. As the door closed, the silence that rushed back in felt heavier than any debt I'd ever carried. I sat back down and realized that for the first time in 50 years, I was truly alone in the building I'd built. The yard was quiet when I pulled in at 10 o'clock. My foreman, a man named Miller who had been with me since 1994, was waiting by the equipment shed. He didn't ask about the shouting at the office or why Leo's truck wasn't in its usual spot. He just looked at the stack of payroll envelopes in my hand. "Are we folding, Arthur?" he asked, his voice steady but his eyes searching mine. "Not today, Miller," I said, "and not tomorrow. But there are going to be some changes." Big ones. I stood on the back of a flatbed trailer and spoke to the 20 men who had built this city alongside me. I told them the truth, that the company had been mismanaged, that a loan had been taken out without my consent, and that I was stepping back into the day-to-day operations to right the ship. I saw the relief on their faces when they realized their checks wouldn't bounce. I also saw the sadness in the older guys who knew exactly what it meant when a son disappears from the family business. That afternoon, I went back to the office to oversee the move. Leo was already gone. He hadn't even packed his framed degree or the world's best dad mug I'd given him a decade ago. But Elena was there, standing by the filing cabinets with a shredder humming beside her. "You're making a mistake, Arthur," she said, not even looking up as she fed a stack of invoices into the machine. "Leo is the only bridge you have to the future. Without him, you're just a relic in a dusty office." "A relic who owns the building, Elena," I replied. "Stop the shredder, now." She pulled the last of the papers through and grabbed her designer bag. "He won't come back from this. You've humiliated him. You've treated your own flesh and blood like a common criminal over a few technicalities." "Forging a signature isn't a technicality," I said. "It's a betrayal of everything I raised him to be." She walked out without another word, her perfume lingering in the air like a bad memory. I spent the rest of the evening sitting at my desk, going through the digital records Silas had flagged. The deeper I dug, the more I realized the consulting fees were just the tip of the iceberg. They had been planning to sell the heavy machinery and lease it back at a higher rate, pocketing the immediate cash for a down payment on a house in Westover Hills. I felt a phantom pain in my chest, the same kind Margaret felt in the stories when she realized her boys had used the family home as a backup plan. I wasn't just losing a business partner. I was losing the version of my son I thought I knew. I picked up the phone to call him one last time, hoping for a shred of the boy who used to help me pack my lunch. It went straight to voicemail. I sat in the dark for a long time, watching the rain streak the windows, realizing that sometimes the hardest structures to repair are the ones you built with love. The rain finally stopped by Tuesday morning, leaving the air in Fort Worth feeling scrubbed and cold. I spent the day at the bank with Bill Higgins, formalizing the transition and moving my personal savings to cover the immediate gaps left by the consulting fees. There was no fanfare, no dramatic confrontation in a courtroom, and no miracle contract that saved the day. There was only the slow, quiet work of untangling 40 years of trust from 5 years of greed. I received a text from Leo that evening. It wasn't an apology or a plea for a second chance. It simply said, "Elena is right. You care more about your bricks than your own blood." I didn't reply. I thought about the 3 sons in Columbus who had missed their mother's 75th birthday, and I realized that some silences are earned. Vance Structural stayed open. I promoted Miller to a junior partner role, and we went back to the basics, honest bids and hard work. The legal fees cost me a significant portion of my retirement, and the house I'd lived in since 1982 felt a little emptier every time I walked through the door. But the locks were new, and the signatures on the payroll checks were mine. 6 months later, I heard through a mutual friend that Leo and Elena had moved to Dallas. He's working for a different firm now, And they're living in a rented apartment after the Westover Hills deal fell through. I still go to the office every morning at 7, and I still sit at the same table where she called me a hateful man. I am 74 years old. I've lost the son I thought I raised, but I kept the name I worked 40 years to build. Sometimes, the strongest structures are the ones you have to strip down to the foundation just to see if the wood is still solid. I sat on my porch as the sun went down over the Texas plains, holding a cold cup of coffee, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't waiting for anyone to pull into the driveway. If this story meant something to you, subscribe. There's more to come.